The farm lay in a remote stretch of land, far from the comforting lights of the nearest town. It was the kind of place where silence had weight, pressing down on you, filling your ears with a low hum that never seemed to end. By day, the fields were a sea of golden crops, swaying gently in the wind, whispering secrets that only the earth could know. But as dusk settled and the shadows stretched long and thin, the farm took on a different life. The once welcoming house seemed to crouch like an animal ready to pounce, its windows dark and uninviting, reflecting nothing but the gathering gloom. Out in the field, standing alone and motionless, was the Scarecrow. It had always been there, or at least, it felt that way. A fixture of the land, much like the old, gnarled tree that twisted upward beside the barn. Yet, unlike the tree, the Scarecrow felt wrong. It wasn't just its worn, tattered clothes or the straw that stuck out from its sleeves and neck like brittle hair. No, it was something else. Something in the way it leaned ever so slightly to one side, as if watching, waiting. The family who lived there, the Thompsons, had grown used to its presence, but never comfortable. The father, a stern man who trusted in hard work and routine, had once joked that the Scarecrow did a better job keeping the crows away than any dog could. But even he, in his quiet moments, found his gaze drifting uneasily toward the figure in the field, particularly at night. And it was at night when the farm's isolation felt most complete, when the wind seemed to carry whispers from the distant hills, and the Scarecrow stood as a dark silhouette against the deepening sky. I first noticed the Scarecrow when I was just a boy, no older than 10. Back then, it looked almost new, its straw-stuffed body clothed in faded overalls, a patched flannel shirt, and a wide-brimmed hat that drooped slightly over its face. The head was a burlap sack, roughly stitched to form the suggestion of eyes and a mouth, a cruel mockery of a smile sewn into its face. But what struck me most was the way it seemed to be looking directly at our house, even though I knew that was impossible. The Scarecrow was my father's doing. He'd built it with his own hands, muttering to himself as he worked, hammering wooden planks together to form its skeletal frame. I'd watched from the porch, curious and a little frightened by the intensity in his eyes as he stuffed it with straw, as if he was filling it with something more, something unseen, something I couldn't quite understand. But there was something else too, something unspoken that hung between us and the Scarecrow. I felt it the first time I walked out to the field alone, the sun dipping low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the ground. The closer I got, the more my steps faltered, the once distant figure growing larger, more menacing. The air seemed to thicken, and by the time I was standing in front of it, my heart was pounding so loudly I was sure my father could hear it from the house. I remember reaching out, fingers trembling as I brushed the rough fabric of its shirt. The Scarecrow swayed slightly in the wind, but its gaze remained fixed on me, its smile a permanent sneer. I yanked my hand back, suddenly afraid, though I couldn't have said why. I ran back to the house then, the image of the Scarecrow burning itself into my mind. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still watching me. Even though it was out in the field, far from where I slept, I felt its eyes, those empty, stitched circles, boring into me, and I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that something was very, very wrong. It started with the small things. At first, I thought I was imagining it, misplacing tools in the barn, only to find them later in strange, inexplicable places. The rake left leaning against the Scarecrow one evening, now lying in the middle of the field the next morning, as though it had been dragged. My father dismissed it, saying I was just careless, but I knew better. There was an undercurrent in his voice, a tension that suggested he, too, had begun to notice things, though he would never admit it. The nights were the worst. The house, once a haven from the vastness of the fields, became a prison of shadows and whispers. The wind carried strange sounds, and more than once, I heard what I swore was the creak of wood, like the groaning of an old tree, or something else. And then there was the soft rustling, like straw brushing against the window, too deliberate to be the wind. One night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the familiar sounds of the farm settling into silence. But this time, the silence was different, heavier, as if something was pressing down on the house, waiting. I got up, moving as quietly as I could, and went to the window. My breath fogged the glass as I peered out into the darkness. The moon was a thin sliver, casting just enough light to see the outline of the scarecrow in the distance. It stood as it always did, arms outstretched, but something wasn't right. I squinted, trying to make sense of the shadows, when I realized the scarecrow had moved. It was no longer facing the field, as it always had. No, now it was facing the house. My blood turned to ice. I wanted to call out, to scream, but the sound caught in my throat, choked by a fear so profound I couldn't move. The scarecrow's head tilted ever so slightly, as if acknowledging my gaze, and in that moment, I knew it was aware of me. The wind picked up, howling through the cracks in the walls, but I could still hear it, the unmistakable sound of straw dragging across the ground, inching closer to the house. I stumbled back from the window, my heart racing, and ran to my parents' room. I shook my father awake, my words tumbling out in a frantic rush, but he just frowned, half asleep, and told me to go back to bed. But as he turned over, I saw it, just a flicker of doubt in his eyes, a shadow of fear that mirrored my own. He didn't believe me, not really, but deep down, he was just as scared as I was. I returned to my room, but sleep was impossible. All I could do was lie there, listening to the night, waiting for the next sign, knowing that whatever it was already too close. It was around midnight when I heard it again, the sound of footsteps, heavy and deliberate, moving just outside my window. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat echoing in my ears as I strained to listen. The house was silent, but the footsteps were unmistakable, coming closer, circling the house with slow, measured intent. I could feel the cold sweat on my skin, every hair standing on end. I forced myself to get up, creeping towards the window, my hands shaking as I pulled the curtain back just a fraction. My breath caught in my throat as I saw it. The scarecrow was no longer standing in the field. It was now right in front of the house, its ragged silhouette framed against the faint light of the moon. But it was the way it stood that made my blood run cold. Its arms were no longer outstretched on the wooden frame. They hung by its sides like a person, and the head was tilted down, as if staring directly into the house, directly at me. For a long moment I just stared, paralyzed by the sight. The scarecrow's once rigid form now seemed almost alive, the straw-stuffed limbs sagging slightly, as if weighed down by something unseen. The wind rustled through the fields, but the scarecrow didn't move with it. Instead, it seemed to lean forward, as though beckoning me to come closer. I couldn't look away. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, but there was no logic to it, no explanation that didn't terrify me. Then, as I watched, it happened. The scarecrow took a step. The movement was slow, jerky, like a marionette being pulled by invisible strings, but it was unmistakable. It was moving, one deliberate step after another, heading towards the front door. I stumbled back from the window, the curtain falling closed, my breath coming in short, panicked gasp. I knew I had to wake my parents, had to get them to see what I was seeing. But before I could move, I heard the front door creak open, the old, heavy wooden door that always groaned on its hinges. I froze, the sound echoing through the silent house. Then, there was the creak of floorboards, slow and deliberate, as though something, or someone, was walking through the house. The steps were too heavy to be the wind, too purposeful to be anything other than real. I could feel the presence, a dark, suffocating weight pressing down on me, and I knew it was inside. The footsteps stopped outside my bedroom door. I could hear the soft rustle of straw, the faint scrape of something dragging across the floor. My heart thundered in my chest as I watched the doorknob slowly begin to turn, the metal creaking under the pressure. And then the door swung open. In the darkness, I could just make out the outline of the scarecrow standing in the doorway, its head cocked to one side, as if studying me. The stitched smile on its burlap face seemed wider now, more twisted, as if mocking my fear. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then, in a burst of desperation, I lunged for the door, slamming it shut with all my strength, throwing the bolt into place. I backed away, my breath coming in ragged gasps, but I knew the door wouldn't hold for long. The scarecrow was here, inside the house, and there was nowhere left to run. Morning came slowly, dragging the night's terror into the pale light of dawn. I hadn't slept. I couldn't. My door remained bolted, but every creak, every whisper of the wind outside made me jump, expecting at any moment to see that stitched smile again, those dead, empty eyes staring back at me. But when the first rays of sunlight finally seeped through the curtains, bringing a weak warmth into the room, I found the courage to open the door. The house was eerily quiet. I stepped out cautiously, my heart still racing, and made my way through the empty hallway, listening for any sign that I wasn't alone. The front door was wide open, swinging gently on its hinges. Outside, the fields were calm, as if nothing had happened, as if the night hadn't been filled with the nightmare of the scarecrow come to life. But I knew better. I walked out onto the porch, the wooden boards creaking under my feet, and looked around, half expecting to see the scarecrow waiting for me. But it wasn't. Instead, it was back in the field, standing in its usual spot, arms outstretched once more, as if it had never moved. But I knew it had. I knew what I'd seen, what I'd heard. And I wasn't the only one. My father was in the barn, sitting on a bale of hay with his head in his hands. He looked up as I approached, and the expression on his face sent a shiver down my spine. There was no disbelief in his eyes now, no dismissive frown. He looked broken, haunted. "We need to leave," I said, my voice trembling. "We need to get out of here." He shook his head slowly, and for a moment I thought he was going to argue, to tell me that it was just our imagination, that we were tired, that the scarecrow hadn't really moved. But instead, he sighed deeply, and the sound was filled with a resignation that terrified me more than anything else. "There's something you don't know," he said quietly. "Something I've kept from you, from all of us." I stared at him, confusion and fear swirling in my mind. "What do you mean?" I asked. He looked past me, out toward the field where the scarecrow stood. "This land, it wasn't always ours," he began, his voice heavy with the weight of a long-held secret. "It belonged to a man named Jeremiah Carter. He was the one who farmed this land before us. A good man, by all accounts, but he was wronged. Wronged in a way no one ever should be." I listened in stunned silence as my father spoke, revealing a story I had never heard, a history buried beneath years of silence and shame. Jeremiah had been driven off his land by my grandfather, who'd coveted the fertile fields and rich soil. There had been a dispute, and when Jeremiah refused to sell, my grandfather took matters into his own hands. No one knew exactly what happened, but Jeremiah had disappeared, and not long after, my grandfather took possession of the farm. They said he went mad, my father continued, his voice barely above a whisper, that he cursed this place, cursed our family. They found his body in the barn one morning, hanging from the rafters. And when they buried him, they said the ground itself rejected him. The earth wouldn't hold his body, wouldn't let him rest. My blood ran cold as I realized what he was saying. The scarecrow, it was Jeremiah. It had to be, the vengeful spirit of the man wronged by our family, come back to claim what was his, to exact the justice denied to him in life. "Why didn't you tell us?" I asked, my voice cracking. I thought it was just a story," my father said, his eyes hollow. "A ghost tale to scare children. I didn't believe it, not really. But last night..." His voice trailed off, but he didn't need to finish. We both knew what he meant. Last night, the story had become all too real. As the days passed, the fear in the house thickened, a living, breathing thing that crept into every corner, every shadow. We couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. My mother kept to her room, barely speaking, her eyes distant, haunted. My father wandered the property like a man lost, muttering to himself, casting nervous glances toward the field where the Scarecrow stood, untouched by the wind, unchanged by the light of day. But I couldn't stay frozen in fear. I needed answers. I needed to understand what was happening, why this was happening to us. So, one morning, after another sleepless night, I made my way to the old records room in town. The air was thick with dust, the faint smell of mildew clinging to the stacks of yellowed papers and crumbling leather-bound book. I searched through the records, piecing together the fragmented history of the farm and the man who had once owned it. Jeremiah Carter had been more than just a farmer. He was a man of deep conviction, a man who believed the land was sacred, that it should be cared for and respected, not just exploited for profit. He had poured his heart and soul into the farm, treating the land as an extension of himself. But when my grandfather had come with his wealth and ambition, all of Jeremiah's hard work, all of his love for the land, had been swept away in a tide of greed. There were whispers of strange things happening after Jeremiah's death. Crops that withered overnight, livestock that died without cause. The locals spoke of seeing a figure in the fields at dusk, a shadow that didn't belong to any living man. And then there were the disappearances. Farmhands, drifters, people who came to work the land and were never seen again. All of it was blamed on the curse, on the restless spirit of Jeremiah Carter, seeking vengeance against those who had wronged him. I found an old newspaper clipping, buried deep in the stacks, that sent a chill through me. It was a small article, barely more than a few lines, reporting the discovery of a body in the field, half buried, with straw stuffed in its mouth. The date was from years before my family had taken over the farm. The name was that of a farmhand who had once worked for Jeremiah. The article was faded, the details sparse, but the implication was clear. Jeremiah's spirit had been restless even then, and the Scarecrow had been more than just a symbol. It had been a warning. I returned home with the weight of this knowledge pressing down on me, heavy as the sky before a storm. The fields were quiet as I approached the house, the air still and suffocating. My father was on the porch, staring out at the Scarecrow with a look of resigned dread. He didn't even notice me at first, so lost was he in his thoughts. "We can't stay here," I said, my voice breaking the silence. "This place, it's cursed. We need to leave." But he just shook his head slowly, his eyes never leaving the figure in the field. "It won't let us go," he whispered, and there was a finality in his tone that terrified me. "The curse, it's in the land, in the air we breathe, in the walls of this house. It's bound to us. We took something that wasn't ours, and now it's taking us." As the sun dipped low on the horizon, casting long, twisted shadows across the fields, I realized the truth in his words. The Scarecrow wasn't just a symbol of the curse, it was its heart. And as long as it stood in that field, there would be no escape. We were trapped, caught in a cycle of vengeance that had begun long before any of us were born. That night, as darkness fell over the farm, the Scarecrow seemed to loom larger than before, its presence an oppressive weight on my chest. And as I lay in bed, the air thick with the scent of earth and decay, I heard it again, those slow, deliberate footsteps, moving through the house, coming closer and closer to my door. The footsteps were louder this time, heavier, as if whatever was making them was dragging something behind it. I lay there, paralyzed with fear, listening as they came closer, each creak of the floorboards sending a jolt of terror through my body. The doorknob rattled, and then, with a groan, the door slowly swung open. The Scarecrow stood in the doorway, its straw-stuffed body casting an unnatural shadow across the room. The stitched smile on its burlap face seemed wider, more sinister, and its eyes, those empty, hollow circles, glowed faintly in the darkness. But it wasn't the Scarecrow itself that made my blood turn to ice. It was the realization that something else was moving within the room. I could feel it, a cold, invisible presence that seemed to seep from the walls, from the very air around me. The Scarecrow didn't move, but the presence drew closer, its weight pressing down on me, suffocating. I tried to scream, to cry out, but no sound came. I was trapped, helpless, as the darkness seemed to gather around me, pulling me down into a place where the light couldn't reach. And then I heard it, a voice, low and hollow, echoing from somewhere deep within the Scarecrow. "You took what was mine," it whispered, the words carrying the weight of 1,000 buried grievances, 1,000 wrongs left unrighted. "Now I take what is yours." The room seemed to spin, the walls closing in as the voice grew louder, more insistent, filling my head with a chorus of pain and anger. The Scarecrow stepped forward, its limbs moving with a jerky, unnatural motion, and I knew that it wasn't just a spirit, not just the ghost of Jeremiah Carter. It was something more, something ancient and powerful, bound to the land by the blood and the betrayal that had soaked into the soil. I stumbled back, trying to escape, but the presence was all around me, wrapping me in its cold embrace. My vision blurred, and for a moment I thought I saw something, a flash of memory, a glimpse of a past that wasn't mine. I saw my grandfather, standing in the field, his face twisted with greed, his hands stained with blood. I saw the land, dark and twisted, writhing under a sky that bled red. And then I saw the Scarecrow, standing in the middle of it all, its eyes burning with a hunger that could never be sated. The truth hit me like a blow to the chest. The curse wasn't just Jeremiah's. It was ours. It had been passed down, generation after generation, bound to our family by the sins of our fathers. And now, it had come to claim me, the last in a line of the damned. But there was something else too, something I hadn't realized until that moment. The Scarecrow wasn't just here to take. It was here to judge. And in that judgment I saw a glimmer of hope. If I could right the wrongs, if I could undo what had been done, maybe, just maybe, I could break the cycle. With a strength I didn't know I had, I reached out, grabbing the old family Bible from the nightstand, the one that had been passed down through the generations, its pages worn and yellowed with age. I didn't know what I was looking for, but my hands moved on their own, flipping through the pages, the words blurring together until I found it. A passage marked with a small, faded ribbon. "The land shall be healed when the sins are brought to light," the passage read. "Only in truth shall the curse be broken, and the spirit set free." The Scarecrow loomed over me, its eyes burning with a dark fire, but I held the Bible up, the words on the page like a shield between us. I began to read, my voice shaking but growing stronger with each word, the ancient verses rolling off my tongue like a forgotten song. The air grew colder, the darkness pressing in, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. The Scarecrow writhed, its body twisting and jerking as if trying to escape, but I kept reading louder and louder, until the words filled the room, filled the house, filled the very earth beneath us. And then, with a final, shuddering breath, the Scarecrow collapsed, the burlap sack of its head tearing open, spilling straw and dust across the floor. The darkness receded, the cold lifting, and for the first time in days, I could breathe again. The room was silent, the only sound the soft rustling of the pages as I closed the Bible, my hands trembling. The Scarecrow was gone, its body nothing more than a pile of straw and rags, its presence lifted like a dark cloud that had finally broken. I stepped outside, the dawn light just beginning to break over the horizon, casting a soft glow over the field. The land was quiet, peaceful, as if the curse had finally been lifted. But I knew better. The curse wasn't gone, it was simply dormant, waiting, watching. And as I looked out across the farm, I made a vow that I would be the last to suffer its wrath, that I would ensure the sins of our family were buried with me. But deep down, I knew the truth. The land remembers, the land never forgets, and somewhere, in the deep shadows of the fields, a new Scarecrow would rise, its eyes burning with the old, ancient hunger, waiting for the next in line.